Basically, PRRI found that over 2/3 of the respondents who identify as white evangelical Protestants responded as either adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism. So, I mean, you're talking 66, 67% of conservative white evangelical Republicans are adhering to this.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. You can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts, at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. In this week's interview, we're talking to South Carolina writer Rick Pidcock, that was him you heard up top, about his experiences growing up in and then leaving the conservative evangelical Christian movement. Pidcock is a columnist for Baptist News and is a thoughtful and deeply informed observer of what he sees as troubling trends inside the Christian right. He has a unique story and perspective. That conversation is coming up. Later in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll talk about a brand new festival of Mexican music in San Antonio. But first, the news roundup. As always, you can find links with sources and more information in the show notes. This week, of course, we have to talk about the earth-shaking, if not unexpected, ruling in the case of Louisiana versus Callais, which effectively dismantled the last remaining pillar of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We've discussed this case and its implications several times here over the past year. It originated in a federal court order that required Louisiana to draw an additional black-majority congressional district after the state's 2022 redistricting left just 1 out of 6 congressional districts with a black majority, despite black residents making up about 1/3 of the state population. The new map was used in the 2024 election, and it did produce a second black representative for the state, Congressman Cleo Fields. But then a group of white Louisiana voters sued over that map, saying that in complying with the previous court order, the state had in fact illegally discriminated against white residents. The Supreme Court ruling in Callais did not quite address that complaint. Instead, the 6 conservative justices on the court ruled that the initial finding by a lower court that led to the new map was erroneous, in essence saying there was nothing wrong with Louisiana drawing districts that directly disenfranchised black voters as long as the intent was not explicitly racist. Louisiana officials had argued that their original map was designed to minimize Democratic voting power, not black voting power specifically. And the Supreme Court had already ruled in 2019 that partisan gerrymandering by itself was legal. So the big takeaway from the Callais ruling is that gerrymandering that has the actual effect of making it less likely black voters will be able to elect black candidates is actually fine under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, unless someone can prove that it was done specifically for racist reasons rather than political ones. Of course, the political parties themselves are racially polarized. Despite Donald Trump's much ballyhooed inroads with black voters in 2024, they still broke for Kamala Harris by a margin of 83 to 15%. So, especially in racially diverse states with large black populations, like most of the South, anything that minimizes Democratic voting power will also almost automatically minimize black voting power. The Supreme Court justices obviously know that. They just don't care. You can read plenty of analysis of the decision and its fallout all over the media and the internet. I want to concentrate first on reactions from people most obviously and directly affected by the ruling. Black Southerners, the same people most responsible for passing the Voting Rights Act in the first place. Stacey Abrams, the Georgia political organizer and former gubernatorial candidate, wrote in a column for MS Now, quote, "For decades, Section 2 gave black voters in the South and brown voters in the Southwest access to the courts to remedy harm. There was something those voters could do when, for example, state legislatures split black neighborhoods across districts or packed Latinos into as few seats as possible to minimize their broader influence. Section 2 was not a perfect safeguard, but it worked and it instituted accountability. Now, thanks to Chief Justice John Roberts, who has made a career of dismantling the Voting Rights Act, and the rest of the Supreme Court's conservative members, that accountability is gone," unquote. She added, quote, This is how authoritarianism is imposed, through incremental decisions that remove democracy's guardrails. We now find ourselves returning to the before times. But instead of Alabama State Police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we have state legislators with poison pens, drafting themselves into permanent power. In a democracy, the faith of the people is born of a belief that they can participate in its processes and benefit from its success. Authoritarians need only break that faith in order to hold on to power or expand it. And the Supreme Court has been hard at work to make it so, unquote. In Alabama, where violence by white police on Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge in March of 1965 helped create the momentum to pass the Voting Rights Act, the state was ordered just a few years ago to redraw a racially discriminatory congressional map. The Callais decision does not immediately implicate that map, although it would appear to leave it vulnerable. Congressman Shamari Figgers was elected to Alabama's newly created black majority district in 2024. In a statement about the Supreme Court ruling, he said, quote, "It will lead to states, primarily in the South, launching immediate efforts to redraw districts in ways that will dilute the impact of black voters and drastically reduce the number of realistic opportunities to elect black members of Congress. This is unfortunate, especially in Alabama, given the role that brave men, women, and children played in this state in spearheading the voting rights movement," unquote. And in North Carolina, the voting rights activist and organizer, Bishop William Barber, spread the blame for the decision beyond just the justices who joined it. He said, quote, "Today, 6 Supreme Court justices closed their eyes to the continuing realities of racial discrimination, racial injustice, and inequity. In 2020, after Biden was elected president with majorities in the House and Senate, many of us argued that COVID-19 relief to corporations shouldn't pass without a renewal of the Voting Rights Act and a commitment to living wages. This did not happen, so here we are," unquote. The Callais ruling does not put equitable representation out of reach forever. Congress could still pass laws setting parameters on how states draw districts, including outlawing partisan gerrymandering. But of course, to do that, you'd need a Congress and president who wanted it to happen. Which brings us to the practical impacts of the ruling on the ongoing battles over congressional redistricting. They were already fevered even before the decision came down, starting with the hasty redrawing of districts in Texas last year with the strong encouragement of President Donald Trump, followed by California redrawing its own map in response. North Carolina also squeezed an additional Republican-leaning seat out of its map. Then just in the last few weeks, voters in Virginia and legislators in Florida approved new congressional maps engineered for explicitly partisan gain. The Virginia map, which passed very narrowly in a public referendum, looks to add 4 Democratic seats, which would change the makeup of the state's congressional delegation from a 6-5 Democratic advantage to a 10-1 margin. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, meanwhile, successfully pushed the state's legislature to sign off on a new map that could add up to 4 more Republican congressional seats, essentially canceling out the Virginia map. Both maps are facing legal challenges. As of this recording, the Virginia Supreme Court has not issued a decision on the legality of the referendum that approved the state's new map. And the pro-democracy group Common Cause was considering its options and objecting to the new Florida districts. Meanwhile, the Callais ruling prompted Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry to declare an emergency suspension of the scheduled May 16th primary elections for the state's 6 congressional seats. He said it would be wrong to hold elections using maps thrown out by the Supreme Court. The court's decision did not actually block Louisiana from using its current maps this year, since the election cycle is already underway. But State Attorney General Liz Murrill said Louisiana is within its rights to pause the election and allow for a special legislative session to quickly draw new maps. Republicans in other southern states are also calling for emergency sessions to reconsider their own maps, specifically to look at breaking up their current black majority congressional districts to make them more Republican-friendly. In Tennessee, Senator Marsha Blackburn and Congressman John Rose, who are both running in this year's Republican primary for governor, called on Governor Bill Lee to convene a special session to divide up Memphis among several Republican districts. Blackburn even posted an image of a proposed map. Memphis is currently the center of Tennessee's 9th congressional district, its only majority black district and the only one currently represented by a Democrat. As of this recording, Lee had not publicly responded to the calls for a special session, but President Donald Trump posted on social media on Thursday that Lee and legislative Republicans were planning to redraw the state's map. Republican officials in Georgia are also calling on Governor Brian Kemp to convene a special session to draw a new map. The state is more closely divided than many southern states, with 5 majority Democratic congressional districts to 9 for Republicans. All 5 Democratic seats are or have been held by black representatives. One of them, David Scott, just died last month, so the seat is currently vacant. 4 of those districts are clustered around Atlanta, the state's largest city and home to the bulk of its black population, who overall make up 31% of the state. If the Republican-dominated state legislature wanted to, it could no doubt slice up at least some of those into less compact districts with more Republican voters. As of the time of this recording, Kemp has said only that he's studying the issue. In Mississippi, Governor Tate Reeves had already called for a special redistricting session to be held 21 days after the Callais decision came down. After the ruling was issued, Republican State Auditor Shad White gloated in a social media post that it opened the way to eliminate the state's only majority black congressional district, currently held by Representative Benny Thompson. Mississippi might no longer have a district drawn to protect Benny Thompson, White wrote. Mississippi has 4 congressional districts. It also has the highest proportion of black residents of any state in the country, at 38% of the population. Eliminating Thompson's seat would likely return them to the pre-Voting Rights Act reality of an all-white conservative congressional delegation. We'll do more coverage and analysis of all of this in future episodes, including the possible impacts on our state legislatures. But the upshot is that between the redistricting frenzy of the last 12 months and what is likely to follow from Callais, congressional representation in the red southern states is likely to get even redder and whiter. Hey, just jumping in with a quick update here. After we had already recorded this episode, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, late on Friday, did in fact call a special session of the state legislature to start this coming Tuesday, May 5th, to consider what he called the fairness of Tennessee's congressional maps and see if they need updating, which obviously is code for breaking up Memphis into Republican-friendly congressional districts and eliminating the state's only black majority district. We will certainly have coverage of that next week. Okay, now we're to my interview with Rick Pidcock. He was born on the campus of Bob Jones University, the conservative evangelical college in Greenville, South Carolina. He grew up as a strong adherent of conservative Christianity and eventually attended and graduated from Bob Jones University in 2004. He met and married his wife, Ruth Ellen, in college, and after graduation, the two of them moved to Denver, Colorado to help start a church. Pidcock, who has loved and made music his whole life, led worship and small group services and occasionally preached. After moving back to South Carolina 7 years later, he volunteered to lead worship for a local megachurch and help them produce their first worship album. He attended an evangelical worship school to study and deepen his discipleship. And in the process, he started to become aware that he had been using his faith to cover over questions he had about himself and his place, not only in the church, but the broader world. A subsequent enrollment in seminary school only deepened his questions. After graduating with a master's degree from Northern Seminary in 2021, he found himself challenging the basis of everything he thought he knew. He is now a freelance writer and stay-at-home dad to his and Ruth Ellen's 5 children. He writes a regular column for the liberal-leaning Baptist News Global, where he tracks and analyzes issues like Christian nationalism, the oppression of women and LGBTQ people in evangelical theology, and the overlap between Christian supremacy and white supremacy. He also hosts a podcast for Baptist News called Highest Power, Church and State, which explores all of these issues. And he's working on his first book, Weapons of Worship, How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism, which will be published this fall. I think he's a really interesting writer and thinker with a valuable perspective on the intersections of faith, culture, and politics. We had a great conversation about all of it. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, Rick Pidcock, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you have written a lot about things that I think are really interesting and sort of have some real urgency in our current cultural and political moment. And I want to talk to you about some of those. But before we get to that, I wanted to start with kind of walking through some of your background. You were literally born and raised in kind of the heart of Southern evangelical Christianity. Just kind of tell me about that and your upbringing and kind of how that shaped you and your faith in your early years.
Yeah, so I was actually literally born on the campus of Bob Jones University. I'm not sure if your listeners would be familiar with them, but they're well known for fighting over the last 50 years in particular for bans on interracial dating, things like that. Ended up losing their tax exempt status over it. So very white centric, fundamentalist, independent Baptist type world. And that's where my parents went to college. It's where I was born. And then basically growing up, I kind of lived in that world. Everything was seen through this paradigm of authority and submission, and you had to be, holy and separate from the world, and it controlled everything that you would do, from music choices you'd listen to movies you'd watch, to what you would wear while you're cutting the grass. And so I grew up in that world, and then when I went to school there as well for college, and then after that, I kind of left that world and became more mainstream conservative evangelical, which would still be pretty conservative, but it's like, the John Pipers and John MacArthurs of the world, Gospel Coalition type places, and so that's where I was for the next 15 years, and I led worship in some smaller church plant situations as well as in a megachurch. And was totally enjoying it and everything. I had some difficult, church abuse situations where I had to leave, but that was where I felt called to in that world. And then around 2015, I went through a worship school, and they told me that I needed to have God awareness and self awareness. And I thought, well, my God awareness is totally fine. I don't have any questions about God, but I've never thought about self awareness. And so I ended up, over the next year, they started walking me through my life story. I started having to, look at all the things that have happened to me in life, and I started to realize, like, I had no idea how hurt I was, and then I started having to listen to other theologians that I thought were heretics. These were liberals, and they didn't understand the gospel like we did, but their writing was healing me, and it was helping me get to know myself more. And then I started realizing, as I started realizing what was influencing me, I started having compassion for myself and learning to actually love myself. And then in that, I started to have compassion and love for my neighbor, which ended up having theological consequences for authority and submission paradigms. So by the time 2019 came around, during this time, I had been in the cleaning industry all those years for my job in order to pay the bills. And so late 2019, my vehicle broke down. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the money to fix it. And so we were like, my wife has a degree in interior design, and she's staying home with the 5 kids. What if she tried to find an interior design job, and then I could focus on what I really wanted to focus on, which was writing? And so that's kind of where the transition happened. Was December 2019, I ended up becoming a stay-at-home dad with the desire to get into the writing career.
And, of course, that's all happening against the political backdrop of kind of the rise of MAGA, and that's the first Trump administration. I guess, did that play any role for you in kind of seeing the way the white evangelical world so quick, after some initial hesitation, but so quickly kind of rallied behind this figure who doesn't obviously portray himself as the most, godly person, obviously?
Yeah, so, being in the cleaning industry for all those years, I had a lot of time to listen to things on my headphones as I was, in businesses or in houses cleaning. So I listened to a lot of sermons, listened to a lot of talk radio. And obviously, one part of that is political talk radio. So I was really into Rush Limbaugh. I was really into Dennis Prager, all those conservative guys, Sean Hannity and everything. And, basically like that's where I was. But then when I started going through this healing process in 2015, I was basically coming to the point where I started to have some questions about my love for my neighbor, and the things I was hearing from Trump was not lining up with that. And so 2016 was the first election that I didn't vote Republican, and I wasn't like quite on board at the time with voting Democrat. I just knew I didn't have the conscience to vote for Trump, but I was still a very politically conservative person. And so it wasn't until like 2017 or 18, I started to, after my theology had completely changed, I was like, it kind of dawned on me, I was like, I'm still a very politically conservative person. I was willing to change my theology, and I'm not willing to change my politics. Like, what kind of sense does that make? Am I that more certain about my allegiance to the Republican Party than I am to my theology about God? And so at that point, I started thinking a bit more strategically about my politics, and ended up leaving that whole MAGA conservative world behind at that point. So,
and so as you started writing, like what was your original goal with that? What did you want to, I guess, discover or illuminate through your writing?
So it's kind of funny, the timing of this, because I'm completely redoing my website this week, and we're working on that. But when I first released my website, I was kind of in this very, like, I wasn't sure where I was going to go with it. I was very into more spiritual writing, dealing with some stuff with worship or with like, your understanding of yourself and neighbor and stuff. So it's kind of like the website right now is very much more in this like Ram Dass spirituality type mode. And I wasn't writing journalistically at that point. And so, so basically at that point I was just kind of open. I wanted to write. I've been writing and blogging, for a long time, but I just wasn't really quite sure. I just knew I wanted to do it full time. And so I just started blogging, and then within 6 months, Baptist News Global reached out to me, and they said, "Hey, we saw this article that you wrote about Hamilton, the musical," and they said, "We really liked it. Would you be interested in us publishing it?" And I said, "Sure." And then after that, I was like, "I've got another idea," and so then it just kind of picked up from there.
Yeah, and can you give, because I think not everybody is familiar with Baptist News Global, and if people just hear the name of it, they might assume that it's, some kind of conservative news website, because I think in a lot of people's minds, baptism, and especially white baptism and conservatism, go hand in hand. But Baptist News Global is not that. So can you just give a little background on what they do?
Yeah, so basically, like in the 1970s, a lot of Southern Baptists weren't where they are now. There was a more moderate to progressive wing. Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist, So it was a very different world than the current world that we have with Al Mohler and all the conservatives and everything. But basically there was this movement called the conservative resurgence, where conservatives came in and they started kicking out all the moderates and the progressives. Anybody who, now today, if you have a woman pastor on your staff, like, you can't be a Southern Baptist. So they basically kicked out all the moderates and progressives. And with that, the moderates and progressives, with the Associated Baptist Press, ended up forming eventually Baptist News Global. And so basically, like, Baptist News Global offers, it's dealing a lot with faith and politics, the news of the day, but it's typically, and they have some conservatives that write there, but it's mostly from a moderate to progressive perspective. And so you're getting a lot of insight that you're not going to get from the conservative world, but you're also not going to get from a lot of your CNNs or MSNBC, because, Baptist News Global will get into what's the theology that's driving Pete Hegseth in the Department of War. Whereas CNN may to some degree have some surface level covering of that, but they're not going to delve into it quite as much as Baptist News Global will.
And so what have you found yourself writing about there, as you've kind of been surveying the landscape of, sort of the modern evangelical movement and world in the United States?
Yeah, so basically it's been interesting because especially in the last 6 years, there's been, because I've been writing for them since 2020, and there's just this convergence on the national stage, especially of religion and politics, and the people who are seeking the highest locations of power in politics are using religious language as their motivation to do so. And Trump would not have won in 2016 or 2024 if it had not been for white evangelicals. And for them, like, they're waging a spiritual war against the Democrats, who they view as being the instruments of demons. And so there's all kinds of theological baggage to work through. And so, this year in particular, I've been looking at a lot of these worship events that are happening. Like, this month, there's a big event where 500 Christian leaders and politicians in the Republican Party are getting together and reading through the entire Bible from front to back, and they're going to be doing like worship intertwined with it. Or like next month, we've got President Trump rededicating the United States to being under Jesus. It's like, what does that mean? And they're going to have a whole day of praise and worship to sacralize this and everything. So it's actually having a real effect on our neighbors, the power that these people are grabbing. And so this year I've been covering a lot of those type of events.
Right, and a lot of this is intertwined with, or as part of, what we call Christian nationalism, which is a phrase that we're starting to see more and more, even in the mainstream media, but I feel like it is often sort of vaguely defined, and people maybe don't have a clear sense of what that actually means. What's your understanding of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so Christian nationalism, it's hard to pin down at times because it's not a univocal situation. So you're going to have everything from Catholics and some conservative Catholics to people like Paula White, who is in the White House Faith Office, who speaks in tongues. She's a charismatic. To people like Robert Jeffress at First Baptist Dallas, who he doesn't believe in speaking in tongues. He doesn't even think women should be preachers, and yet he's on the stage with Paula White. And so there's a lot of variety in that world. But basically, there's a group called the Public Religion Research Institute, and they talk about how Christian nationalists are basically people who believe that the United States should declare America to be a Christian nation, that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, and that if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore, and that being Christian is an important part of being an American, and that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. And so they basically, look at these people, they poll people, and they find out, like, are you an adherent to this type of mindset? Are you more of a sympathizer? Are you a skeptic, or are you a rejecter? And they can measure where people are on that spectrum, depending on how they respond to the questions that they've designed.
And is that growing? I mean, because of course there was, through a lot of the 20th century, there was a bit of a withdrawal from the public sphere of a lot of the more fundamentalist Christian denominations, in the sense that, the kind of render unto Caesar view, that's not our world. And we're now many, many decades past Jerry Falwell and the rise of, the moral majority and this really deliberate engagement in civic life. Is that growing? Are there more people who are comfortable saying, yes, this is what I think, that we should essentially govern according to somebody's definition of biblical principles?
So there's a couple ways to handle this. Like on a massive, scale level, basically PRRI found that over 2/3 of the respondents who identify as white evangelical Protestants responded as either adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism. So, I mean, you're talking 67% of conservative white evangelical Republicans are adhering to this. But then also, like, on another level, there's these individuals who may seem fringe. Like, there's a guy named Doug Wilson in Idaho. A lot of people, he's part of a small denomination. Hardly any people know about the denomination. You'd think he's kind of obscure. But he's also the guy who is over the churches that Pete Hegseth is a part of. And Pete Hegseth is running the Department of War based off of this holy war language that we're seeing creep up in a lot of his attacks on Iran. And Doug Wilson is the one influencing him. And so there's both, like, this, 2/3 of these people are believing this, but then there's these obscure figures who are now being put into places of real influence and power in our government.
And I guess, how do you think, how should American Christians who are maybe not of that particular persuasion think about this and respond to this? And are people, people who are in the sort of shrinking but sort of old mainline denominations, are they even engaged or aware of this, or is it all sort of happening somewhere out of their view?
So mainline denominations, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me on them, but they're definitely less Christian nationalist than the white evangelicals are. But I believe it's still a bit over 50% went for Trump, and so there's still a big problem in those churches that need to be dealt with. And thankfully, like, that's where a lot of these conversations are taking place. Like, there's been a lot of mainline churches who will hold different events with scholars like Kristen Dumais or Jamar Tisby or Diana Butler Bass or Robert P. Jones, who runs the PRRI. And they'll have conversations about this. And it's interesting because it's mostly a white audience that attend, but at least they're listening. And so there's some movement there and some intentionality to try to grow them beyond those spaces. And I'm thankful for that work, even if they're not, quite where they should be.
I wanted to ask you a little bit specifically about the Southern Baptist Convention, which, as you say, has been moving progressively more conservative for decades now. And I know one column you wrote recently that I saw talked about a particular push to really make it into sort of an explicitly Christian nationalist organization, which it is not currently. And I think maybe, again, people from the outside might think, well, the SBC, they're already very conservative. How much of a change would that be? But that would still be a pretty significant shift, wouldn't it, for the SBC, which I think is still the largest single denomination in the country, to openly embrace this kind of language of dominion?
Yeah, so the SBC is kind of tricky to deal with now, because a lot of churches, you may not even know if they're Southern Baptist. A lot of churches have taken Baptist out of their name. They may appear as like this cool, hip community church. But when you get to their homepage of their website looks really welcoming. It looks casual. But then when you get to the About Us page, you'll start to, and you look at their theology, you realize, oh, I see what's going on here. And I think there's less of a need among their people to identify as specifically a Southern Baptist, and they're more identifying with these power dynamics of authority and submission, because that's what their theology ultimately is. John MacArthur he's passed away now, but he would talk about how the entire universe is structured through relationships of authority and submission, and they apply that to men and women. Men are to be the heads of the home, women are to be submissive to their husbands, and so that permeates everything. And you're talking about a denomination that was born in the midst of slavery, justifying slavery. So they believed in the headship, basically, of white men and the submission of black people. And so, like, this is in their DNA, and that you strengthen the power of those at the top, and that dehumanizes those below, and then it wages war against those who won't submit. And so, basically, I think that's what's really going on in a lot of these churches is they like to they're in this weird space where they want to exercise power over their neighbors, but they also want to attract their neighbors to their good Father. And so you often find both of these impulses at play in the way they're presenting themselves.
Right, and gender roles are obviously a major component of this, and you talked about that, the kind of complementarianism idea that men and women have separate roles as kind of set out in Scripture. And this is something that Doug Wilson, for example, is a big proponent of. And I think it has sort of shocked some people for there to start to be conversation for some of these quarters of like, well, women shouldn't even be able to vote and women should not be out working. And again, I guess my question is just like, how actually widespread is that, not just view, but that, how many people are actually living out that kind of domestic authoritarian lifestyle that, again, if you're not in these circles, might not be all that visible.
Yeah, a lot of people, it's weird because a lot of people, I was in that world, and that was my theology for a long time, but we didn't function in that way. There was this idea in our marriage, theologically, I was the head and my wife was to submit, but functionally, we had a good relationship and we just dealt with decisions as a team. And so there's this disconnect between, I think with a lot of people, there's a disconnect between their theology and their lived out life. And that can produce a lot of internal shame because, in my particular situation, I wasn't providing a lot of money for our family in the cleaning industry. I don't have the personality to be like theologically directing my family and trying to like control their beliefs and everything. But like theologically, I believed I should have. And so there was a lot of shame that I experienced there. So I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, like I said, when they told me I needed to have self-awareness and I said I never thought about that. I think there's a lot of that going on. A lot of people just lack the self-awareness of what their church teaches and what the implications would be if they actually lived that out in their lives. So I think, the people who are in power, they believe those things. The Gospel Coalition is a big publishing website that puts out article after article, each week about the stuff, promoting the stuff, and they're made up of 77 men on their board. And you can't have like 77 men and 0 women. I don't remember the exact number, but it's up there like 70 somewhere in there, So it's like really? So the people who are shaping the average person in the pew, they all believe this kind of stuff. But to what degree the people in the pew do, it may vary.
Right. It's what actually goes on in anybody's home is always going to be shaped by the people who are there.
Yeah.
So I know you're working on a book. I guess your first book you're preparing to publish this fall, and that gets into the world of music and its role in evangelical worship, which was your world as well, right? You have a background in this. What is that book about? What are you looking at?
So basically, you'll notice these, like I'd kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, there's this, these different people come together for these services, these worship services especially, that are formed oftentimes as political events. but they're branded as revival services. So, like, we saw this at the Charlie Kirk funeral. There was a lot of worship leaders, mainstream worship leaders there singing songs, and then that would open people up. Like, they're singing songs about power, like the highest power, and then you're opened up and you're feeling emotional, and then Stephen Miller comes up and he's demonizing people and saying you have nothing, you are nothing if you don't submit to us, you can create nothing. Trump, I hate my enemies. And so there's events like that. There's leading up to the 2024 election, there was a tour called the Courage Tour where they targeted specific areas where if they thought if we could just get more Republicans to show up and vote for Trump in these areas, then we could swing the vote in the swing states for Trump. And so they hosted these revival services that would look like a revival service, but you'd start with worship and get everybody riled up through the music, and then instead of like a pastor preaching, you'd have a politician come in. And instead of preaching from the Bible, they would preach from the GOP platform, basically. And then for like the altar call, instead of, giving your life to Jesus, Billy Graham style, you would be signing up to work the polls or, get out the vote. And so there was a lot of those things going on. 10 days before the election, I was on the National Mall covering a Sean Foyt event where they had Trump invited them and welcomed them, and then they're doing spiritual warfare against their neighbors, and they're wielding worship as a weapon. To fight their neighbors as if they were demons. And so I'm covering a lot of those things, everything from that to like just your average Sunday morning service, because there's a big difference between the person in the pew just holding their coffee, wanting to enjoy some fun music with the worship band, and the people in Seattle waging warfare against their LGBTQ neighbors while the police put their knees in their backs. There's such a world of difference between those events, and yet they're creating very similar dynamics, whether people are aware of them or not, by, forming what they value.
Right. And of course, music has always been, I guess not in every denomination, but in many denominations, white and black in the United States, music has always been this real force. And I think we think of it in the black church as being sort of a force for resistance and social justice and social change. But kind of what you're kind of talking about the opposite of that, I guess.
Yeah, and I actually have a chapter on race and ethnicity where I start with the way white colonizers committed genocide against the Native Americans and how they utilized worship to as a rallying cry to commit their genocide. And I get into specific songs and specific quotes that they used. And then I get into like the Civil War. And that's a really interesting one because you've got the North and the South, both sides used music to fight their war. They had musicians traveling with them. And a lot of their songs were like out in the open, conquering songs. Stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. It's all these like, we're out in the open and we're going to conquer the South or we're going to conquer the North. And you can see the way their different ideas shaped their lyrics. Whereas black people during that time, they were having to sing in hiding under wash bins, and they had to sing in code. And so they actually, the spirituals, like they were about longing for liberation, and they had lyrics in code that could communicate a plan for actual liberation, or that helped them identify with the people of Israel, for example, longing for liberation from Egypt, and they're having to do it in private, or they could be punished. And so you think about how those two completely different contexts, just between white soldiers and black slaves, are going to affect their songs. The song of the empire is very different than the song of the slave. And then I trace that trajectory into some of the mess we have today in the worship industry, that's very racially segregated, whether people realize it or not.
Wow, well, that all sounds Fascinating. So that book will be out this fall, is that right?
Yeah, September 29th, that's being released with Broadleaf Books.
All right. Well, we'll link to your website and the show notes so people can find information there and follow that. And I guess just to wrap up, I'm just curious, how do you characterize yourself, your faith at this point, and also what ramifications has your own journey had on your relationships with friends and family? I mean, obviously you came out of a world that you've kind of moved away from, and I think often that's a difficult thing for people.
Yeah, so we ended up, we left the church in 2019, and I still was at seminary pursuing a degree in worship at that time, but I've kind of like come to the place where I don't really resonate with labels, because labels hold so much meaning for other people that I wouldn't really ascribe to. But at the same time, like there are very real power dynamics at play here. Ancient empire dynamics that are being mapped on to modern society that are incompatible with democracy and are incompatible with loving your neighbor as yourself. So like the people in the Bible were on the underside of empire. And they were throughout the Hebrew Bible, they were on the underside of multiple empires. And in the New Testament, they were on the underside of the Roman Empire. And so I feel like for me to just leave that world and to not interact with it, when I see the people in the Bible wrestling with longing for liberation from those powers, and then I see my neighbors today on the underside of a sacralized empire that a lot of conservative Christians are wielding over them, to me, it's a conversation that I can't walk away from. And so I don't attend church anywhere. I believe that, but there's a lot of significant conversations that I think I can have a part in participating with to help foster a self-awareness among people that, in my hopes, would then lead them to love their neighbors as they could love themselves.
And how has that resonated through your own life and your own relationships?
It's, I mean, my world is a lot smaller than it was. Leaving the church, we left all of our friends, basically. So my friends in life, they're all like within the last 6 years. It's led to a lot of family strain, because then everybody's concerned for your soul and the souls of your kids. And so, yeah, it's like being in exile, and that's why I call my Substack Exiles in Christendom. Sorry.
That's fine.
And that's why I call my Substack Exiles in Christendom, because that's what I kind of feel like. There's a lot of us who are in very different places, but we're all kind of in the wilderness outside of this tower that we've left. And, I just want to let others know, hey, I see you, and I'm here, and we're going to be okay, if we stick together.
All right. Well, that's a good place to wrap up. Thanks very much for your time and your writing, and I really think you are helping to illuminate some things, and from a perspective of deep knowledge that we all need to probably pay more attention to. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Latido is the Spanish word for beat or heartbeat. It's also the name of a brand new festival taking place this Friday, May 8th, in San Antonio, Texas. The Latido Festival is a celebration of Texan-Mexican culture, community, and music, specifically música norteña, the music of northern Mexico and the Texas border country. Norteño is a fascinating melange of early Spanish and Mexican music that was heavily shaped by European influences brought in during the mid-19th century rule of Emperor Maximilian. An Austrian Archduke, Maximilian imported Central European culture and music, including waltzes and polkas. The music spread into the Mexican countryside, even after Maximilian was overthrown and executed, and it's why you hear norteño bands using tubas and accordions in addition to guitars. The songs most associated with norteño styles are called corridos, ballads that can be romantic, historical, and rife with tragedy and danger. A subgenre known as narco-corridos tell tales of drug smugglers and gangs, with the earliest of them dating to the 1930s. By the 1990s, they were so associated with the growth of drug cartels, and often accused of romanticizing them, that there were attempts to ban them from Mexican radio, in much the same way that U.S. politicians of the same era became alarmed about the growth of gangster rap. One of the bands playing at the Latido Festival is Los Tucanes de Tijuana, norteño legends who have been active since 1987. They don't shy away from narco songs, even releasing an album in 2008 called 20 Narco Corridos. Here's a sample. Also on the roster is the Tejano singer La Mafia. Of course, there will also be plenty of food and drink at the outdoor festival, and plenty of room for dancing. The Latido Festival is a natural for San Antonio, which has about 1.5 million residents and is the largest majority-minority city in the United States. It's about 65% Hispanic and Latino. So, if you're lucky enough to be there this Friday, have a great time. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.